BBC News at 6 o'clock. This is Zep Soames. Good evening.
I am today announcing that I will resign as leader of the Conservative and Unionist Party on Friday the 7th of June.
After months of struggle over Brexit, Theresa May has announced she's standing down, acknowledging her failures and saying the country needed someone new at the helm. The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said Mrs May was right to resign, but party colleagues lined up to pay tribute to her, some at the same time as announcing plans to stand for election as her successor. The favourite, Boris Johnson, thanked her for her stoical service to party and country. The President of the European Commission said Mrs May was a woman of courage, but that sorting out Brexit was now the primary concern. President Trump said Mrs May was a good woman and that he felt sorry for her. In other news, the US has announced it's to deploy 1,500 more troops to the Middle East amid heightened tensions with Iran. 2 teenage boys have died and 4 other children, including a baby, are in hospital after what police have described as an incident at a house in Sheffield. Theresa May has bowed to pressure from her own MPs and announced her resignation as Conservative leader, paving the way for a new Prime Minister to take office in 2 months' time. In a statement outside 10 Downing Street, Mrs May's voice cracked as she brought an end to a turbulent period in office that's lasted less than 3 years. She said she had done her best to deliver Brexit, but had failed, and it was in the country's best interests for her to make way for someone else. Mrs May will stand down as Tory leader in 2 weeks' time, but she will continue to serve as Prime Minister while a leadership contest is held. Our first report tonight is by our assistant political editor, Norman Smith.
Theresa May, for so long trapped and tormented by Brexit, today finally conceded defeat. Confronted by a party in open revolt and a cabinet that had all but deserted her, Mrs May finally bowed to the inevitable. Faced with the stark threat of being ousted in an immediate vote of no confidence, Mrs May chose to go voluntarily, announcing she would stand down as party leader on June the 7th, in the wake of President Trump's visit and the D-Day commemorations. That will then signal the start of a crowded contest to replace her, with a new Prime Minister expected to be in place by the end of July. Speaking outside Number 10, with her husband and close aides looking on, the enormity and finality of that decision appeared to hit home, as Mrs May, instinctively an incredibly reserved and controlled politician, appeared close to tears.
I will shortly leave the job that it has been the honour of my life to hold. The second female Prime Minister, but certainly not the last. I do so with no ill will, but with enormous and enduring gratitude to have had the opportunity to serve the country I love.
Inevitably, Mrs May's premiership will be defined and remembered by her failure to deliver Brexit. In an effort perhaps to soften that verdict, Mrs May today pointed to other achievements: the end of austerity, a long-term plan for the NHS and the race disparity audit. On Brexit, however, Mrs May struck a distinctly defensive note.
In a democracy, if you give people a choice, you have a duty to implement what they decide. I have done my best to do that. I negotiated the terms of our exit. I have done everything I can to convince MPs to back that deal. Sadly, I have not been able to do so.
Mrs May gave no indication of who she might like to succeed her, but she did appear to caution against any leader who might seek to pursue a more uncompromising form of Brexit. The Conservatives, she said, must remain a moderate party on the common ground, and Brexit, she warned, could only be delivered through compromise. Compromise, she said, was not a dirty word.
It will be for my successor to seek a way forward that honours the result of the referendum. To succeed, he or she will have to find consensus in Parliament where I have not. Such a consensus can only be reached if those on all sides of the debate are willing to compromise.
Advice which many of Mrs May's critics might argue she herself conspicuously failed to follow, only reaching out to her political opponents late in the day when her Brexit deal already appeared in its death throes. Perhaps, had she sought compromise much, much earlier, then Mrs May's time in Downing Street need not have ended in such disarray and failure.
The favourite to replace Theresa May, the former Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson, has been an outspoken critic of her deal with the EU. Writing on Twitter, he praised her statement as very dignified, thanked her for her stoical service, and said it was time to come together and deliver Brexit. He's also been speaking at an economic forum in Switzerland, where he confirmed that he would stand for the leadership.
I'll repeat what I said, completely unprompted, at a recent meeting of the British Association of Insurance Brokers. When I was asked exactly that question, I said, am I going to...
Of course I'm running.
Of course I'm going to go for it. But I do not, if you will forgive me, I do not wish to elaborate now on what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. But you will be, believe me, you will be hearing possibly more about that than you necessarily want to hear.
The Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn said Theresa May had accepted what the country had known for months, that she could not govern with a party that was divided and disintegrating. He said her successor should call an immediate general election.
The reality is a new Conservative leader isn't going to solve the problem. There has to be another opportunity for the people of this country to decide who they want to be in their government, how they want the government to be run, what the long-term strategy is of that government. I think we need a general election. We don't need another Tory leader installed by Tory MPs.
Scotland's First Minister Nicola Sturgeon said her relationship with Mrs May had not been easy, but she deserved thanks for her service as Prime Minister. Ms Sturgeon said there was a big risk that the next Conservative leader would take the UK out of the EU without a deal.
I will continue to do everything I can to protect Scotland's interests against a Brexit that we didn't vote for and that the vast majority of people in Scotland do not want. But the experience of the past 3 years, coupled with that prospect of somebody like Boris Johnson becoming Prime Minister, makes it all the more important now that Scotland is given the chance to choose a future as an independent country.
Mrs May's predecessor, David Cameron, who resigned after losing the EU referendum, said he felt desperately sorry for her.
I know what it feels like when you come to realise that your leadership time has finished, that the country needs a new leader, and it's extremely difficult and painful to step outside Downing Street and to say those things. But I think she is and she was a dedicated public servant. She worked incredibly hard on our behalf. I think she deserves our gratitude for that, and this would be a very difficult day.
In the past hour, President Trump has been giving his reaction to reporters at the White House.
I feel badly for Theresa. I like her very much. She's a good woman. She worked very hard. She's very strong. She decided to do something that some people were surprised at, some people weren't. It's for the good of her country. But I like her very much. In fact, I'll be seeing her in 2 weeks.
It's thought more than a dozen Conservative MPs are considering standing to succeed Mrs May. The Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt has become the latest to announce a leadership bid. With his assessment of the runners and riders is our political correspondent, Chris Mason.
It's a party hungry for a contest, a battle of ideas and an opportunity to stress test the vision of those who aspire to replace Theresa May. The membership was denied a say when Mrs May took over, as she was the only candidate left standing before the grassroots could be consulted. That won't happen this time. The Grand National is running twice this year, joked one senior Conservative today, a nod to the crowded field already assembling. Alongside Boris Johnson, a battalion of the similarly ambitious. His successor at the Foreign Office, Jeremy Hunt, chose an event in his constituency in Surrey to confirm he would stand. He joins fellow Cabinet Minister Rory Stewart among those committed to running. Former Cabinet Ministers Esther McVey and Andrea Leadsom have indicated their interest too. Fellow Brexiteers Michael Gove, Dominic Raab and Steve Baker are also attracting support. Even Sir Graham Brady, the long-standing chairman of the 1922 Committee of Conservative backbenchers and regular deliverer of bad news to this Prime Minister, is contemplating the idea of being the next one. Plenty of others are too. For weeks already, hustings in all but name have been taking place, but they were merely pre-season training. The competition is now underway.
As the front-runner to succeed Mrs May, Boris Johnson looms large over the field. The former Foreign Secretary and Mayor of London is popular among party members, But a political career littered with gaffes has led to reservations among some of his Conservative colleagues. Our political correspondent Ben Wright considers Mr Johnson's chances of securing the top job.
Front-runners can fall, and this feels like Boris Johnson's to lose. He has had his ambition to run the country thwarted before. In 2016, after years of self-deprecating denials that he wanted to succeed his old Eton and Oxford rival David Cameron as Prime Minister, Mr Johnson went for it. But after leading the Brexit campaign, he was abandoned by his fellow Leave supporter Michael Gove, who torpedoed Mr Johnson's chances after questioning his suitability for number 10. Promoted to Foreign Secretary by Theresa May, Mr Johnson's performance in the role further increased scepticism among some Tory MPs. In November 2017, Boris Johnson faced criticism for suggesting the jailed charity worker Nazanin Zaghari Ratcliffe was training journalists.